There we go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. My name is Ryan Maloney. I work here in the Education and Programming Department, and on behalf of our Executive Director, Tracy Hyder-Suffern, and our artistic team of John Batiste and Christian McBride, we want to welcome you here to the museum tonight. How many is it your very first time here? Okay, a few of you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks, even though we had this apocalyptic storm, right, that we were supposed to, I think it's because we've been waiting 3 years for any snow. Like it finally came and everybody was like, oh, it's going to be, it wasn't that bad. And we knew it wasn't going to be that bad. So we appreciate you guys sticking it out through a little bit of the dusting of snow this morning and sticking it out and coming out with us. So those of you who are back, thank you for coming out, hanging out with us. If you did make a donation to the museum, either via our ticketing page or on your way in, we greatly appreciate it. We're able to provide free and low-cost programming because we have a lot of incredible supporters like the New York State Council on the Arts, Department of Cultural Affairs here in New York City, the Gilman Foundation, and a number of others. But what really connects the dots financially for us is when we get donations from individuals. It helps us offset the costs of our artist fees, of keeping the lights on, paying our staff. So those of you who made a donation, we thank you. If you would like to make a donation on your way out, Maciel is there. She's more than happy to take a donation via card, or there's a cash box you can dump a little bit in. No pressure, but it does certainly go a long ways to helping us continue to offer these programs, which at this point we're over 100 in a year. So we do a lot of public programming. If it's your first time, you know, there's plenty of opportunities coming up for you to join us again. This program tonight is one of our longer running series, Jazz and Social Justice. I think we're on volume 22 at this point. And we do a couple a year, so you can tell that it's been around a little while. It's a great opportunity for us to look at how the music and culture and people in our society mix, and how elements of the music are always playing a role within social justice issues that we face in our country and around the world. So this program is made possible through the curation and the hosting of the gentleman I'll introduce next, Mr. Larry Blumenfeld, who, if you've read anything about jazz in the last 20, a bunch of years, you've probably read something from Larry, either in the Wall Street Journal or any of the major jazz publications around the world. So I'll pass it on. Please welcome our curator and host, Mr. Larry Blumenfeld.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, I think one meaning of the word community is coming out in the sleet, in the cold. So I appreciate you doing that. Yeah, this is the 22nd time we're doing this, and before that, the National Jazz Museum in Harlem was generous enough to host quite a number of ideas I had, first about New Orleans culture, then about the connections between Cuba and New York. And this particular series, Jazz and Social Justice, kind of, well, I guess we started it after a certain election, but it was really about and you know, in a way we could have called it Jazz is Social Justice, or Jazz as Social Justice. And really it was about the fact that there were great musicians that I knew who were making important music that often was tied to important issues that we could then talk about after the music, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Over the years, we've had editions that focused on immigration policy, environmentalism, the incarceration state, gender justice, quite a number of things. Tonight, it's sort of maybe even more basic, the idea of community and how art and culture and music bind us and hold us in a community, which I think is a lot of what this museum is about. If you were to come here once a week through the year, you'd feel that and know that, which isn't true at every institution. After the music, we're going to have a conversation in which this wonderful woman, the executive director, Tracy Hyder-Suffern, will join us as well. So if you read me anywhere that I've ever written in, yeah, it's a lot of years, in the Village Voice when it was around, in the Wall Street Journal where I still write, in websites like Daily Beast or Salon, in music magazines, you would come upon something along the way that I wrote about Arturo O'Farrill. Not just because he's a magnificent pianist, composer, band leader, musician, but because more than anyone else in my lifetime, the arc of what he does off stage, the art of what he does with his art form really underlines what we're talking about, what culture can do, what it can mean, why we gather around it, and why he has an organization now that he calls Belongó, which we'll talk about. So really, I don't even remember how I phrased this. Was it belonging, the art and idea of community, something like that. In any case, first great music, then a conversation, which is the right order, I think. Please help me welcome on bass, Bam Rodriguez, on drums, Zach O'Farrill, and at the piano, Arturo O'Farrill.
overjoyed to overcome. And we played a piece, and of course, some of you know this, I'm a big political person. I have a reputation for speaking my mind. And the piece we opened up with, a lot of people have forgotten about the issues facing the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. And that piece was written by the great bassist Andy Gonzalez. And believe it or not, Puerto Rico is not for sale. Believe it or not, Puerto Rico is a place that is not going to be carved up into billion-dollar apartments. It's just never going to be. And the people of Puerto Rico won't let that happen, no matter how ravenous the people, the usurpers, want to be. And that piece always fills me with hope, because what can be more beautiful than the people in this island nation of Puerto Rico? Nothing. We're going to continue. So anyways, that's this is Bam Rodriguez on the bass. Zachary William O'Farrill on the drums. And my name is Arturo O'Farrill. I'm very grateful to Tracy and the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and Stephanie and Ryan, and of course my dear friend Larry, who we've been friends for so many years, and have had so many opportunities to play music for you, and as a part of our lives. We just grew up together in some ways. We're going to continue with a piece that's a little bit emphatic. It's a little bit emphatic, because the person who wrote this piece doesn't BS. He wants change. He wants it not now, right now. And that's the name of the piece. Not now, right now. Not now, right now. When? compai, which is a word that means closer than a brother. In Latin households, your compai is usually your son or daughter's godparent. It's also combined with the word el generalismo, because there are some people that you hang out with and your partner says you cannot go out with them ever again. Because you know that if you hang out with them, you'll be back a week later, or you might end up in Cleveland with them. One such friend of mine is Doug Rice, and one of the founding members of our organization. I'll talk about in a second. I'm going to close, but before I do, I'm going to do another statement, social statement about the people of Cuba. And make another statement about the people of Cuba, who I had the privilege of visiting maybe 4 or 5 times a year since 2002, and primarily it began as a journey to complete for my father, who died brokenhearted that he was never able to go back. Then it became a mission. It became a mission to see and learn about my people. All of a sudden I started calling them my people. All of a sudden I started seeing myself in their faces, and that was a freaky moment. If you go into Cuba and you go and you look at the faces of the people, you will see transculture. You will see transculture. You will see Asia, Europe, Africa, the indigenous world. You will see it in their faces. That's exactly what the planet is fearing in this time now. This planet is fearing all kinds of people coming in and disturbing, as Trump said, poisoning. It's a horrendous thing what's happening. And so for me to see my people, and I know they've got problems down there. I know they got problems with the way they're governed, and they have problems with themselves and how they work, and blah, blah, blah. But the worst problem they have is the embargo. The worst problems they have is that the richest nation on earth is starving them. The worst problem they have is that the richest nation on earth won't sell them needles to distribute vaccines with. It's just a horrendous crime, and it has to go down easily. It's one of the most horrendous crimes of modern history, what we're doing to my people. So I'm going to play for you a piece that is written by Ernesto Lecuona called Si Bonet. Bam Rodriguez. Zachary William O'Farrill. My name is Arturo O'Farrill.
Forget about a little bit of slush. I would walk through a raging snowstorm to hear something like that in this space. So please give it up again for this this community of three here. We're gonna let this brilliant bassist get some water and sit down and hang out, but we're not gonna let Zach or Arturo go away. And we're going to also call up Tracy Heider-Suffern. Belonging, the sound and idea of community. Congratulations again to you for being a community with us, and for whoever's online being a community with us that I've probably turned my back on. And, you know, Arturo talked a little bit, and, you know, anyone who wants to give me their email address when we're done, I'll send you a very long story I wrote when Arturo let me come along the first time he brought his father's music back to Cuba. And yeah, if you were to read what I've written about him, a lot of it has to do with what's wrong with U.S.-Cuba policy, why we don't want to build walls around our country, why we might want to think about jazz the way they do here and not worry about what it's not. But really, the thing that makes those conversations, those political actions possible, is some sense of community. And we can sit down. I'm going to encourage you. I'm vamping now. We're sitting down. And so, yeah, we're going to, I mean, it might be a shame to hear that glorious music and then, well, we're going to talk. But as you can tell from the way Arturo plays and the way he talks, that the ideas that I'm bringing up are never far from what he's about when he's making music. So, you know, the very first thing that you guys invited me to do here was a series that was about New Orleans, but it wasn't like historical. It was about right after the flood, right after the failure of the levees that led to a flood, right after people were sent away with one-way tickets. And it was about that culture and the fact that I learned that culture, like, they had second lines right after, not long after the devastation. And the CNN cameras would come and they'd be like, wow, look, the people are dancing in the streets and they can still party, isn't that cool? And it took me a while to understand that that music, that culture was actually those people saying, these are our streets, we're back, we're not going anywhere. They were showing you how we own these streets, and it sounds like this. And I did not understand that. And I guess, you know, that's one example. Arturo started to talk a little bit about the example of Cuba. So Tracy Heider-Suffern is executive director of this wonderful place, which it is not easy to be head of a nonprofit arts organization in 2024 in the United States. But it's really hard to do it in a way that invites community and resists the temptation to just court funding. Well, not court funding, but court dollars. If you haven't figured it out, Zach O'Farrill, this amazing drummer, is the son of Arturo O'Farrill, his eldest of two sons. And yeah, Arturo talked about seeing it in the face. You could see it in the face. He is, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but he is not just a fundamental player in the organization that Arturo founded, but he has founded his own nonprofit organization that is an expression of the very thing I'm talking about. And Arturo alluded to his father, the late, great Chico O'Farrill, a composer whose music kind of busts those walls just musically. He's also a less literal son of the late, great Carla Bley, who he toured with first as a teenager. So I want to, Arturo, maybe if you could talk a little bit, you talked a little bit about what it felt to start feeling a kinship in Cuba, but what did it feel like, when did you first, in your career or development as an artist start to sense there's a community value here? I'm not just learning music and playing music.
Well, to be honest with you, I was a punk-ass little kid, and all I wanted to do was make money and tour the world and get laid and smoke pot.
I think you still are a punk ass little kid.
I learned a lot in the years. I learned a lot over the time period, and it really took me until I wrote this record called The Offense of the Drum to really realize that music is a good way to pass the time till you die, unless you use it to build community. Unless you use it to build humanity, it's a paper tiger. And then that record, more than anything I've ever experienced, got me to think about, it was written about, I can feel free to speak here, we're among friends. It was written about a despot, a horrible mayor in the history of New York City named Rudy Giuliani, who...
I don't think you have to worry about many jazz fans being Giuliani supporters.
But he one of the things he did after selling out the soul of New York and replacing all the paintings in City Hall of former mayors. I mean, this guy's nuts. But in any case, one of the things he did that I found really offensive was to satisfy the gentrifiers in the city. He started to arrest drummers, because the first thing that happens when gentrification happens is, we don't want any noise. We don't want to hear those musicians. We don't want to hear that radio. We don't want to hear the partying. And the first thing he did was literally arrest drummers and take away their drums. And this has been written about.
Kick the drummers out of the parks.
This has actually been written about. And so that was really the beginning of my journey to understanding that there was something much more important than notes and chords and downbeat reviews and Grammy awards and much more important stuff than that. And that was building a sense of one another and a sense of wonder about one another in our midst.
And of course, if you're a student of the history of the United States, the history of slavery, you'll know that the taking away of drums has a rich history, because drums call people to commune, among other things. So I remember there was a moment when Wynton Marsalis asked you, Arturo, to create an Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra, which became an amazing orchestra. And then there was a moment when let's say that orchestra got released. But I kind of knew this orchestra, something new will happen. And what began was this thing called the Afro Latin Jazz Alliance. And then there was a moment where it grew into something now called Belongó. So how can you describe what the ambition of Belongó is and its ambition slightly across town from here?
It actually kind of coincided with my conceiving of the recording The Offense of the Drum and started really thinking. That was after we'd left Jazz and Lincoln Center, and it was actually a very amicable parting. I sat down with Wynton and I said, did we bring dishonor to the House of Swing? And Wynton was very genuine. He said, no, you have not brought dishonor to the House of Swing. You have brought honor to the House of Swing. But what happened is we can't afford it. Right. We can't afford it. We don't have a philosophy for it. We don't have a business strategy for it. And so here I am, just kind of, for whatever reason, ejected from the center of the jazz universe. And I said, well, I'm not going to roll over and play dead. I might not be able to ride in your Rolls Royce, but I'm going to buy me a BW, man. And so I put together my wife. My wife and I put together, we went, I remember, to Citibank on Union Street in Park Slope and opened an account. And I borrowed $40,000 from my local bartender. And I went to the toughest school in New York City and asked for a residency, and I put together a board of advisors, and we filed for 501c3 in Delaware. And we did that in the space of 3 months after being let go from Lincoln Center. And we grew, every year I set goals for myself. I said, if we don't have an executive director by year 3, we're going to give up. If I don't have a budget of $100,000 by this every year, much to my dismay, we met those goals. Every year, much to my chagrin, we superseded our goals to the point where just before the pandemic, and I will tell you quickly about the pandemic activities, just before the pandemic, our budget was over $2 million, from $40,000 to $2 million in the span of 13, 14, 15 years.
$40,000 in bills.
$40,000 in bills.
In a brown paper bag.
In a brown paper bag. My bartender gave us a paper sack filled with 20s. I made Allison wear plastic gloves when we counted the money because I had no idea where it had been. But, I mean, the thing that I found as time grew that I was much happier watching people draw close together than I even was making music. And I'm a really dedicated musician. I love it. As I told you when I first sat down, this is an inordinate privilege for me to still be in love with sitting at that instrument and playing for people. But I realized that that's a slim excuse to bring us into this room, into bigger rooms and bigger rooms and bigger rooms, and circle around bigger and bigger campfires. And so the campfire grew and grew and grew, and just about 2 years ago, we went through a major re-strategy, philosophizing and thinking about changing our name, because it turned out that we were doing something much bigger than music. We turned out that Latin jazz, whatever that entry point word is an entry point into a much larger discussion about agency and identity and sovereignty and who gets to tell the story of the story of the story of who you are and who your people are and who others are. Whew. So, about a year and a half ago, we were invited, and we've been a part of Harlem for as long as I can remember. We had our first official headquarters in the Harlem School of the Arts. We were at the New York City Mission Society. We've had our offices on 125th Street. But about a year and a half ago, the people of Spanish Harlem, El Barrio, requested affordable housing from the city. And so the city requested proposals for building affordable housing in Harlem. Imagine that. And the contractor that bid, the winning proposal, had a cultural component to it. And so all of a sudden I found myself testifying before HUD commissioners and the city council people and community boards. And I found myself thinking, wow, this actually might happen. And so I think maybe a year ago, the year and 2 months ago, Mayor Eric Adams, Commissioner Lori Cumbo, Adrian Adams, and Mark Levine allocated $11 million to the creation of Casa Belongó, the Afro Latin Jazz Community Alliance Performing Arts Center. And so we are breaking ground. We're breaking ground in, I think, sometime in early 2025, 19-story affordable housing building called Timbali Terrace, with the first 2 floors being Casa Belongó. Now, to quickly just explain why Belongó, why we changed the name, is we knew we had grown way beyond just producing concerts. We knew we had grown. We had 47 teaching artists in 21 New York City school districts, buying instruments for students, taking a pre-professional training program all around the world. We knew that we were doing much more than just visiting nursing homes, community centers, and working with the incarcerated. We knew that it was much bigger than any of us understood. And so the first thing that happened is we had a study of names, possible names that we could call ourselves. And at that point, I was an associate dean for equity, diversity, and inclusion at UCLA. And the word inclusion really bothered me because it implied including you from the outside in. And I hated that. I began to hate that, and I began to think about what it really needs to be: equity, diversity, and belonging. Because we already belong, we already pertain, we have full vested citizenship in this music. We have full vested citizenship in this culture, in our lives. This is we, you and I, and so many people around this world need to understand that we don't need to be invited. We're here. And so I came up with this word, Belongó. It worked because it's also the name of a song that every Latin musician has inscribed on their heart, Belongó. And it also had the word belong in it. And belong is what I feel we're doing. We're building a place that you already belong to. And we're just saying, please, come take your home. Come, you're home with us.
So sometime in the future, there'll be a shuttle bus that will go back and forth between here and there, and that will be your community. Now, Zach, I could tell you that Belongó and its precursor, Afro Latin Jazz Alliance, has been one of the great educators throughout this city, and creating opportunities for young musicians or just young people who want to be part of culture. And Zach has played a central role in all of that. But you know what? I really want to ask you more about, can you talk a little bit about Opera Next Door and why it started and what it is?
Yeah.
Because it's quite a story.
I do have to just bring attention to one thing you said that I need to make sure I correct, lest my wife psychically, come after me. But you described it as my organization, and it's our organization, but it's really her organization that I work with and help her out with.
See, the thing is, I remember when he first got married, and I'm always like, "Hey, how's married life?" And he's always like, "It's great, it's great." So I want to mess with that a little. No,
Yeah.
I'm glad you. And wait, and her name?
Her name is Sasha Gutierrez. Yeah.
A magnificent singer.
I'm sorry?
She's
an operatic soprano. She's from Cali, Colombia. And we met at Manhattan School of Music, not too far from here, when we were both doing our masters. And basically, the Opera Next Door was born, was another pandemic baby, really. Cheaper than a pandemic baby, thank goodness.
Wait a second.
No, but basically during the pandemic, I think June of mid June of that first pandemic summer, when New Yorkers, we know how to stay safe. We know how to we know how to toe the line, right? So the moment the weather started getting nice, everyone in New York was like, all right, we can be outside. We can do things outside. It's fine. And so, actually, a band that I play with, who played here a lot, a band of my friend Cali Rodriguez, is a trumpet player from Cuba, we realized that everyone in that band, including Bam on bass, by nature of not being from this country, was in town. Like, Bam's not going back to Venezuela for the pandemic, So we realized everyone was in town, so it was like, oh, man, I'm so tired of playing music alone. I'm so tired of playing music through a screen. I'm so tired of laying down tracks and then listening later to how it sounds. It's like, we can go outside. The weather's nice. I have all the backline we need. I have drums, congas, keyboards, amps, whatever. Let's just meet up. Let's take the stuff downstairs, set up 6 feet apart, and just play. So we set a date for that, and when Sasha heard that we were going to do that, when I told her that we were going to do that, I actually think you were at the house when we decided to do it. I think you were at the house. You were at the house. We were laying some tracks down when I sent the band a text. She was like, "Okay, well that's great. When you guys finish your set, I'm gonna sing a set of what I've been working on, because her music during the pandemic had been singing along with backing tracks and practicing on the roof. And she was just like, if you guys are gonna play, then I'm gonna play. And it's like, great, wonderful. So we played our set, Latin jazz. It's fun. And she starts her set with she plugs her iPod into an amp, or iPhone into an amp, and puts on the backing tracks and sings along. And she sings her opera. And over the course of that summer, between mid-June and Halloween, I think we did probably 14 or 15 of these Stoop concerts. And everyone always really liked the instrumental music. It was always really well received. We never had complaints from neighbors. In fact, the neighborhood was super excited and grateful, and it really became a meeting point for the whole neighborhood whenever we did concerts. But the opera singing would stop traffic. And we realized that nobody had actually really heard that kind of singing in person before. The extent of people's familiarity with opera tends to be cartoon characters falling asleep, or like Bugs Bunny in a Viking helmet. So it would stop traffic, and talking to our neighbors, talking to our friends, talking to people who would come by, we realized people have never heard this stuff. People are interested in it. So another bass player friend of mine, Walter Stinson, one time we were just hanging out, and he said, "You guys ever thought about staging a whole opera on the stoop?" And we hadn't, and we still weren't considering it at that point, because it sounded like an obscene amount of work. And but over the course of that pandemic winter, looking for things to do, that became our project. It is an obscene amount of work. Every time we do one of these shows, it takes us a couple months of recuperation to feel human again. But yeah, over the course of that pandemic winter, we started putting together a cast, started rehearsing and whatever was possible over Zoom, setting details, talking to the police precinct, talking to our neighbors, getting a feel for if people were into it. And in May of 2021, we did a back-to-back days, Saturday and Sunday. I think you were there, and you were there, and you were there. We did back-to-back shows of Mozart's Così fan tutte with we double casted, so we had 2 6-singer casts. We had an 11-piece chamber orchestra. We projected translations on a screen, so people could read the translations in real time. We even went through the subtitles, and updated them so that like the jokes and the phrasing kind of was a little bit more relevant or impactful for a modern audience. And we managed to close down the street both days, both afternoons in a row, to traffic so that people could bring their lawn chairs or their picnic blankets or their inflatable sofas, or sit on the opposite stoops. And we did it was like a 2.5-hour show. The audience was rapt the whole time. The audience was laughing along with these jokes from mid-18th century Italian opera. And I even made a deal with Mr. Softy to come by during intermission and sell ice cream. I told him we needed him not to drive by during our dress rehearsals with the music. So I made a deal with him because he was a little annoyed because he said that people had been coming and yelling at him all week. Every time he would stop, he would come by playing music, selling the ice cream. Like, man, if I had known that, I would have told people not to yell at you. You got to make your money. You got to do your business. But we made a deal, and so for our 2 dress rehearsal days, he didn't drive down the block, and I told him, if you give me your phone number, I'll call you when the show starts. You come back the truck down the exit of the block, and you can sell more ice cream in 15, 20 minutes than you do in a whole day. And he did. And so in the process of figuring out how to raise money for that first production, we realized it feels a lot more legitimate if we come up with a name for an opera company behind it. So that was the Opera Next Door. But when it went well, when Sasha and her brother hit the ball out of the park on the first try with a logo, and just the good vibes, the whole thing, and everyone asking us, are you going to do it again? Even the guy selling ices, the guy who's came through with the icy cart on the bike, and he sat there the whole show watching the opera, selling the occasional icy, and he asked me the next weekend, when's the next one? I was like, I can't even fathom the next one. We realized, we have a little community-based opera company on our hands.
Now, I remember when you first did that, and of course, on one level, it was, I don't know if you remember that moment, we were all coming out of our shells in our homes, and my life is filled with hearing live music all the time, but it was so long that the first time I went out, it was like, oh, I forgot. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that level, for you and Sasha, there's a reason why all those people only relate to opera as something from a cartoon or a commercial.
It's gatekept.
But so for you or Sasha, was there some element of, hey, maybe producing an opera in the street is also a bit of a political action against that exclusion?
It really only occurred to us when we were pretty far along the process. It really only occurred to us once we were on the site rehearsing and staging and having people come and our only method of promotion was people passing by and handing them a flyer or telling them a date. Yeah. And it was only at that stage where we realized that there was something very subversive about it. There's something very very political about taking it out of the giant theater, about not charging admission for it. There was something very political about, I find a lot of these big legacy arts organizations, when they try how they fill out their post grant report for outreach, it's like free tickets are great. Going into a school for a class is great, or inviting some schools to an open dress rehearsal is great. But a free ticket presupposes several really important things. One, presupposes the ability to get there. Right. 2, it presupposes an interest. Right. And 3, it presupposes the combination of those things. It presupposes that you are interested and willing to get there for this free ticket.
And no, you're
and sometimes at the Met, sorry not to name names, but it presupposes your ability to get there on a work day and stand in line for 2 hours to get those rush tickets.
And feel like you are comfortable there too. But you're bringing up something that's really interesting, and I wanted to ask you. And I do. You're sitting here, so very soon I'm hoping this turns into a conversation among all of us. But, Zach, you bring up something interesting, which is, there is a lot of really good quote-unquote community outreach from a lot of institutions and organizations. And that's all really nice, but it's sort of like a little ante-room or an add-on or a thing we do so we'll get more funding, or even just a goodwill, right-hearted extra. But I feel like there is a difference between that and this idea, back to the people in the street in New Orleans or the people at the Rumba in Cuba or where the thing itself, the art itself is the outreach, and the community itself, it's not just being brought to the audience, it is the audience. Mm-hmm. I feel like, Tracy, can you talk a little bit about, if you're away from many spreadsheets or donors or which probably doesn't leave that much time, what is it, in your experience here, how have you experienced community here? And how does that filter into what you and Ryan do?
Sure. I will say that I've been here 6 years now, and thank you. One of the reasons I was asked to take on the job was because of my experience in social justice, gender equity, racial justice, poverty issues. And so one of the great charges from the Board of Trustees was to build an audience, to build basically a congregation in this space that looked like Harlem. And I have had the good fortune of, does anybody know who Wu-Tang is? Well, I'm from the same neighborhood. Long before Wu-Tang was even a glimmer in somebody's eye. I grew up in the same public housing. And one of the advantages of that public housing and that era, the 70s, the 80s, even the 90s, was the sense of community. So we had, what do you call it? Community houses, not houses, community centers, I'm sorry. Where people gathered, and you gathered around music. We had, I still remember Mr. Farrell in the big park, because the big park was right behind our building, playing the guaguancó. You knew summer was here when Mr. Farrell, who was from Panama, pulled out the congas and started playing the guaguancó. So the sense of community was bred into us, was bred into the community. So when the charge was to build a room that was reflective of Harlem, I did it the only way I knew how, and that was I literally, as I said, I'm from Staten Island, and I commute from Staten Island to be here every day. So the sense of walking around in a community and taking a long journey, going on a walkabout, was second nature to me. So I literally started going up and down the streets of Harlem like a crazy lady and introducing myself to people. Hi, I'm Tracy. Do you know that there's a National Jazz Museum in Harlem? Do you know that we have a couch? At the time, we had a couch. It's really hot outside. You can come in, we have air conditioning. Or it's really warm outside. Really cold outside. You can come in, we have heat, and we have great music. So the community was built around music and jazz almost as a second thought. The community was literally built around community. Come on in, meet me. You can come in any time. And at that time, before the pandemic, we were open 5 days a week, and our hours were a little bit more extended than they are now. And I would tell people, come on in, just hang out. You don't have to do anything. And you also don't have to pay to get in. And then after being here for a little while, we really started to give a lot of thought to, well, how do we really intentionally build artists into that community? So we opened the space up as a free rehearsal space to artists. Tell your friends. We opened the space up as a showcase space at cost. I've told you that a million times.
I have a short memory.
We opened it up to artists as a free rehearsal space during business hours and meaning when we're open to the public or not. As long as it's during the days that we're here, there's space available. And we also open it up as a low cost or at cost showcase space. And so we're always thinking of ways to include community in what we do. You see some of the evidence of that here. We're always looking for ways to introduce people or to bring people into not only the physical space, but into the music from where they are, not where we think they should be. So we have jazz and fashion. We've had jazz and poetry. What you're looking at on the walls around you is we decided to introduce an artist in residence series where we invite local artists into the space, and we change every month, or just about every month. We invite local artists into the space to show how they are inspired by jazz, or how jazz is a part of what they do as artists, and specifically artists who are not musicians. So we are always intentionally looking for ways to show people that this is their home. Arturo said something when he was closing his remarks. One of the things I do when I welcome people into the museum, and I say it to you, is the first time you're here, we invite you to come home. And once you're here, this is your space, welcome home. And we're very serious about it. It's in everything that we do. And I want to refer also to something Arturo said about inclusion. We work really hard not to bring people around a table. We work really hard to tell people we need to build a table. Right. And you need to be a part of that table. So, I mean, and that's a euphemism, of course, for how we go about business in the museum.
Right. No, and I think it's something I've always appreciated. I mean, where these streets right around here, of course, are historic for largely for the incredible cultural life, important internationally resonant music and culture that happened here and affected so much. Have there been things that surprise you about the community that still remains?
I think what surprises me more is what's different. Arturo, also, not to keep quoting you, Arturo, Arturo talked about the offense of the drum. And one of the things that
those drums you heard as a girl, that's what Giuliani wanted to shut down.
That's what he wanted to shut down. But gentrification has shut down the drums in Mount Morris Park, right? Yep. So there's that. And there is just this whole sense of how, in good and positive and negative ways, right? So I used to live in Harlem many years ago, and I remember not being able to be a stranger to walk up and down Lenox Avenue. In this part of Lenox Avenue, it's not like that anymore. So there's positive and negative. One of the things I appreciate most about Harlem is something that's probably not obvious to a lot of people. Being from Staten Island, and being from Staten Island during a certain period in time, I'm real familiar with what a village looks like, right? I grew up in this very small town, Staten Island place, and Harlem is actually very much like that. If you know what to look for, if that whole idea of walking up and down the street and introducing myself to people was not unusual to people. What was unusual was that they didn't know me and that they didn't recognize me. But I had an anchor. I had a place that I called home here, right here, and I invited people in, and that was not unusual to people.
You know, one I will say, just I have so much love for this place and this organization, and one of the things I'll say is, I'm old enough where there only came a moment where we're celebrating something called jazz, and maybe there'll be museums about it, and we were really scared that, museum, that will kill and mummify this thing called jazz. And even if it doesn't, or also, it will be, okay, let us tell you, here is the story of jazz as told by, take your notes, go away. And really what I've loved about this place is, first of all, it's very much living, right? It's an open space for the continuation of things, and it's also a space for, sometimes the walls will tell you those stories, but it's tell a bunch of stories. You invite me to keep telling my story, and what I do mostly is invite people in and we investigate their stories. And it's just, if you were to look at over the course of the year, how many things that are free or by donation that are happening that are just extending the story. And the other thing I'll add is, because I love this exhibit, and you know, there's a great effort. The other great walls that are built are between poets and visual arts and dancers and writers and musicians, and then which category of each of those art forms they're in. Anywhere I've ever gone that A is a black community, or in this hemisphere, it's music, food, visual art, dance, spoken word, poet, all together. And if you try to separate them, that's like a way to start a fight. Or at least it's the denial of the thing. You know, I'm glad you talked about gentrification, because, you know, all that reporting I did in New Orleans after the devastation of a flood, the people I know, the true culture people I know in New Orleans now, tell me what's far more dangerous than any of that is Airbnb and Uber. That Airbnb and Uber are a greater threat to that culture than the flood and its devastation was. And, you know, if you think about it, it's because who lives in those houses? Who, you know, what is a local tourism economy about versus an algorithmically run corp? I wanted to pose, and then I'm going to open it up. Well, you know what? Do any of you have a pressing question for one of these three people? And please feel this is like a conversation, or just something you want to add to what we're talking about. You can talk. All right, you, and then you just talk loud.
I just wanted to ask you about volunteer opportunities.
Me?
Yeah.
Everybody here is welcome to be a volunteer. But here's the thing. We get asked a lot about volunteer opportunities, and we say what I'm getting ready to say. We're looking for volunteers, you're welcome, and then people don't come, right? So if anyone would like to volunteer at the museum, we're a small museum. Our former chair used to describe us as small but mighty. And you heard Ryan say we do closer to 200 events every year, right? We're this tiny little organization at 58 West 129th Street in central Harlem that looks much bigger than it is. And we're really proud of that. We do amazing stuff here. We need help. And so we need help to keep that that kind of programming going. We need help that help is an invaluable resource to us. So we invite you to volunteer. It doesn't matter what your skill is. We'll figure out something that you can do to help us and to help us grow, to help us survive. But if you want to volunteer, you're absolutely welcome. We'd love to welcome home, right?
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right, you had your hand up, and then.
So you mentioned, COVID was an interesting time, right? It brought that community together, right?
It was not without its charm. It was challenging, but it was not without its charm.
So where do you think the community is now? Those connections that were made, the innovation that is happening. It's really fascinating how.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak most authentically about my own block, which is where we did our first opera, which is where we did that first production. And you know, I have to say, there's definitely been what I think is a permanent before and after. So I've lived on the block for about 10 years, and there definitely, I think, back in the day, that block was probably everyone knew each other, and it was, you know, kids playing on the street and everything. And then, of course, you know, modern times happened, everything slows down. But then during the pandemic, people really came out again. People really got to know their neighbors again, and that hasn't stopped. I'm really happy to see that on our block in Bed-Stuy that remains the case, and everyone knows each other. Everyone says hi. There's friends on the block, and you know, people do events. Like Sasha and I aren't the only ones who do events on the block. Michael every year does a quiche off on the community garden on the corner. We have a block party every year, and there's just always stuff going on. And so I'm really happy to see that, at least in our idyllic corner of Bed-Stuy, that's still the case. And I wouldn't be surprised if you know, not all neighborhoods in New York are conducive to that neighborhoodly feeling. But I think the ones that are, I think people I think people value that more than they did before the pandemic.
Can I just add one thing too? Because I think that that community, that online community, has not gone away either. We've just recently programmed our 175th virtual Birdland. When the pandemic first happened, my immediate thought was, oh my God, musicians are not going to be able to pay their bills. And so what we did is we got the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra together to sit at home in this mind-numbing labor of filming themselves playing and then assembling it in Final Cut Pro and Logic, and putting on, and what we saw was an online community that was worldwide, that could not make it to New York, that could not make it to Birdland, that did not have the funds to go to Birdland. And to this day, we just literally, this is 3 years later, and we're still producing online programming, but even more importantly, we're still seeing that some people need it. And so this community of people that we have on a block-by-block basis is actually global. And what has happened as a result of the pandemic is we've become aware of how minded it is to think that it's just your block. It's not just your block. It's the entire borough, the entire city, the entire United States, we are inexorably intertwined. And if we don't start acting like we really believe that, we're in a mess. We're in a whole lot of trouble.
Right before you answer your question, I want to jump on that for a minute too, because like I said, coming out of that COVID period, it was like, oh my God, this elixir of being together with people, hearing live music, experiencing that again. I forgot that I had that in my life. But as with everything, there's good and bad. So I think there's a lot of great things happen. Right. So if you were to go on the virtual Birdland things, broadcast, those were incredible because it was a feat of artistry. Someone took 17, 18 different individual things and spliced them into actually an artistic presence that was different than the live one and a whole new thing. And then, you could be in North Dakota or Australia, and that's all great. But I think a certain number of people, a lot of people are like, oh, we used to have an office. We don't need an office anymore. Everyone can work remotely. And I think a lot of people started feeling like, well, it can replace. And, my son goes to a New York City public school. They weren't open today. It wasn't a snow day. It was a remote learning day. Like, I don't want to go off on that, but I've been very mindful of what important lessons can we learn from that? What strand of technology can help us? But let's not, because I think it's very easy for people to say, oh, well, actually, we can just, I interview people for articles. Why can't you just Zoom? Because I want to sit across a table from you and feel your vibe, and see where your feet went. All right, so now you had a question.
Wait, I just want to throw in there that those people that say, oh, we don't need an office anymore, those digital nomads are gentrifying the hell out of cities like Bogota, San Juan,
Right.
Mexico City, Madrid, Lisbon. Those cities are getting unlivably expensive for people who live there because of all the people who are like, oh, I can just work from anywhere with my computer. And they're willing to pay
Right.
almost American prices, which are
Right.
sky high other places.
There are a whole lot of problems to that, but if you're running an online marketing firm, I'm not going to comment on it. But for all the things we're all talking about, there's a certain level of humanity and a certain level of artistry, no matter what you're doing, that you do not want to get lost. Now, Virtual Birdland, they somehow retain that.
Well, we did a couple things that I think made a lot of sense to me. We used the platform to raise funds to keep freelance artists when the pandemic first happened. And still, to this day, there's no contingency plan for wait staff, for bar staff, for freelancers, for musicians, for actors, for comedians. And we used the platform to raise a lot of money to help people stay in their homes. But that's also the other thing I wanted to mention is that while just one episode of Virtual Birdland sticks out to me. We did an episode called Munira, and we had a percussion ensemble from Kuwait, a guitarist from Abu Dhabi, a percussionist in Peru. I mean, we had a trumpet player in London. We assembled a truly global experience that was, and for my money, and I know a lot of people would argue this, it is virtually, this is the lesson that I learned that I'll never forget. It's not the medium. It's not the concert hall. It's not the nightclub. It's not the classroom. It's the intentionality. Right. Do you bring your best self and your most open self to whatever that experience is? And we did, and I think it touched people's lives. A lot of people can't get out of their wheelchairs. Right. A lot of people can't afford to go to this nightclub. Right. A lot of people can't, I mean, to me, it's amazingly important, more than anything else, that we continue to develop ways to reach people that are not able to move, who are not ambulatory. And that's what this experience did for me.
Now, you've been very patient, so.
First of all, I want to know what block on Bed-Stuy. I'm originally from Bed-Stuy, so I want to know what block on Bed-Stuy you're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Willoughby Avenue between Marcy and Nostrand.
Oh, okay. And then I want to know, I worked on Staten Island for 11 years, so I want to know what village that you compare Staten Island and Harlem.
Sure. So I'm not just talking about a place, I'm talking about a time. I'm from Stapleton Projects.
Okay.
All right. All right. So that's Broad Street, Gordon Street, Warren Street, Hill Street, for people who don't know. It's 8 buildings, 8 floors per building. No, okay. So, but I'm also talking about a time, right? So I am from a time when I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody either was related to each other or went to high school together, or so it was a certain time, and even Staten Island isn't like that anymore. But it was that small town, small village, almost rural. Like, I got in trouble coming home late from someplace one time because there was a cow in the road, and my parents wouldn't believe that the bus was held up for 4 hours by a cow, right? So I really am talking about the 60s, the 70s. I left out the 60s deliberately because I wasn't trying to say how old I am. But
I was there from 73 at Willowbrook.
my mother worked at Willowbrook. You probably knew who my mother was, right? So, and my uncle. Yeah. So the sense of community. I was on a public bus one time. My mother, about 13 years ago, and this woman said to me, my mother's nickname was Dolly. Are you Dolly's daughter? I had never met this one before in my life. And she remembered me from the one time that my mother brought me to work at Willowbrook when I was 12, right? Because I looked like my mother, right? So that's the kind of village. But I'm also talking about a mentality, right? I remember when my parents bought the first key to our apartment. I grew up in a place where you didn't need a key, and you'd lock the door if you went away for the weekend, but you left the windows open so the house could be aired out, you know? So just that whole idea of, back to the music thing, for 30 years in my mother's tiny little apartment in the projects, every Saturday afternoon, and I've told this story a million times, the entire family, the entire neighborhood gathered in our apartment to listen to music and to dance. Everything I know about music, I learned from my mother, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of music. And my uncle, her brother, was a singer. I remember one of my earliest memories is refusing to take a bath because my uncle was rehearsing in my grandmother's living room. So my mother had to fill an enamel tin with water and bathe me while the group rehearsed. Right? So just this whole sense of growing up around the music. My mother danced with my uncle at the Palladium. They were dance partners, right? These are stories I've told. I'm old enough now that I do that thing where old people repeat the same stories all the time. I do. I have five stories. I tell them all the time.
We're not telling the story about the
We're not
gas
talking about the
station.
time
Okay.
I tried to blow up the gas station. No,
not doing that.
when I was 9. But that whole sense of belonging and that sense of neighbor.
At the meeting place.
The meeting place and the firehouse. Okay, these are Staten Island references, and I know how you lived your life now. But what Zach and Arturo are talking about, and the question about collaboration and community, back to the beginning of the pandemic, one of the first things we did was we started reaching out to our neighbors here and figuring out ways to combine our resources with theirs so that we could survive the pandemic together. We knew very quickly, it was early, when we figured out that if we didn't collaborate, if we didn't come together in community, we were not going to survive. We weren't going to survive as an organization. We weren't going to survive as individuals. We're not going to survive as the community that we built here in this space and in the streets around the space. And that comes from that upbringing that I'm talking about.
It's interesting that the pandemic showed us that as much as, you know, we like to think that technology has made it easier to stay in touch and to be, you know, to communicate with each other, it's actually had the opposite effect, and we've become more, our tendency has grown to be more insular and in our bubble and separated from our community.
Yeah, I think that happened anyway. I think that as soon as Jeff Bezos started delivering everything to you, toothpicks, socks, people realized they didn't have to leave their homes, and so a lot of folks just sit and veg.
Yeah, I'm saying it didn't occur to people until the pandemic, and it was
I mean, it's
obvious.
been
It was in your face.
there's been this constant and ever growing, almost like Pavlovian effect of passivity and resignation that has happened. I mean, there are food robots delivering food in Los Angeles. There are Uberless taxis in Phoenix and I mean, it's just, we're getting rid of so much of the need to be in each other's presence that it's not funny. And so this place, this is a sanctuary. What we're building is a sanctuary, and physical proximity to one another is de rigueur for us to be able to survive as a people.
How are we going to keep up with what's happening with Belongó and the opening?
It's incredibly easy. Belongó.org. BELONGO.org. And also, we're at the Art Space on 99th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. So, man, come by. You're home here, you're home there. We welcome you.
Okay, we have a little bit of time.
Okay, being that you are a resident of Brooklyn, where you are out in Williamsburg over there, have you ever been invited to play at the Brownstone Jazz on Macon Street to take your music there? Or back in the day when 966 Jazz was going on?
Oh, I played at 966 for sure.
Oh, okay.
You played at the Up Over. And
At the Up Over Jazz Cafe, Bob. And, oh yeah.
Have you ever played at
Not the Brownstone, no.
I've passed by that house on Macon.
Love to do it.
Yeah, I haven't. I don't know those folks.
All right.
I'm ready.
you need to bring your music to the Brownstone?
I'm ready to do it.
See, for me, the way you guys are throwing it back and forth, it's the same as the way Arturo is throwing it back and forth with his rhythm section. So the thing is, we talked about that we have this tendency not to go out and get together, but we did. We went out. We got together. I'm really happy about that. The whole idea, or my idea, one of my inspirations for this was that these would just be little ripples that maybe however many people show up, you either carry or you don't. And we see, and I will say that no matter how divided or closed-minded someone might feel, there is no way they could have sat through those 30 minutes of music and held that pose. At least for those 30 minutes, they would have had to relax that pose, and their mind would have been opened a little bit to some possibilities and some weird feeling of humanity. I don't know that that saves the world, but I think it changes the picture a bit. So I wish we didn't have to stop. We do have to stop. I was serious. Give me your email address. I will send you a long article about Arturo O'Farrill. I want you to know that this man, Arturo O'Farrill, has 6 Grammy Awards, but those
8.
8? Is it 8? Oh, man. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I see. I need
The Latin Grammys count too.
They can, but those Grammy Awards are a byproduct of the things he was talking about here, and not the other way around. And it's something I've learned over literally decades of being with this man. I want you to know that you can hear Zach O'Farrill in many different musical contexts, and they're all different, but they're all as brilliant as that. And remember, the organization is
Opera Next Door.
The Opera Next
The
Door.
Opera Next Door. And you already know Tracy. She's already said, it's like, you got those friends or those relatives who they keep letting you come back, and then you tell them some crazy idea, and they're like, yeah. So that's Tracy.
This is the place,
That's
National
the National
Jazz Museum in Harlem.
Harlem. I really want to thank you. Please, I wish this could continue, but you keep it, make it continue. Go ahead. That's what we're doing. Please help me thank them for a wonderful conversation. Oh, and I'm Larry Blumenfeld, and I'm from and
Thank you,
in
Larry.
Brooklyn.
Larry Blumenfeld, y'all.